thank you, Stan, and the organizers for the opportunity to be here. I think this is a really important conversation to have, and I think the mix of AI and neuro, cognitive science, philosophers, and robotics is exactly the kind of audience that we should have to have this kind of important dialogue. So we've heard a lot about replicating brain functions in artificial devices and how they relate to human brains. But there's another important aspect of what we can do with AI and neurotechnological devices, and that is to treat human neurological disorders. So what I thought would be useful for this group is to sort of talk about the present status of neurotechnology to kind of ground us on where we are. And then at the end, just bring up the discussion of barriers and potential that I hope will lead into further discussion with the group of you here. So here is my absolutely, and in fact you can't even see the brain that's behind it very well, but this is my ultimate reductionist view of the nervous system, in which sensory information comes in, it gets processed through some perceptual filters, through brain circuits, and then leads to action. And as we know, there are a number of devastating disorders that disrupt function at each of these stages. We can lose, importantly, the two, I think, very important senses for us, hearing and vision, often are disrupted by degeneration of the receptors that carry that information in while preserving the pathways into the brain. And we can also have paralysis when a stroke or spinal cord injury or disorders like ALS disconnect the output of the brain from the body, so that one can think about moving but not move. And then finally, brain circuits, which I summarize very crudely, can lead to a disruption of brain circuits or abnormal brain circuits, abnormally functioning brain circuits, can lead to deficits in cognition, like memory decline or many other disorders, emotion, like depression, or movement disorders like Parkinson's disease, where the circuits controlling movement are not functioning. So there have been advances in neurotechnology for sensory replacement, for motor output replacement, and for circuit modulation, all of them addressing ways of trying to replace or repair these kinds of disorders and try to restore the brain to its normal function. And AI, I think, will play an important role in helping us to be able to create devices that will function and be able to seamlessly replace all of these functions at some point. So the problems that we face are really come from two big domains in solving these problems. One is the neuroscience problem, and we really need to understand what is the nature of the signals, what are the nature of processing, that is, what are the neural codes? And there may be numbers of neural codes, not just one. And this is, these scientific inquiries, of course, are among the most complex because we don't know when we'll stumble onto new profound answers of how neural information is coded. Engineering is sometimes more hopeful because I think we can often have a better sense of where we're going when we know the limitations of the materials, the limitations of the technology that we have. We've had Moore's law to help with computing, but it's also subject to disruptive change. But the key now is, what are the tools that we can create to adequately read out or write neural signals? And I'll classify these things as neural interfaces, ways to interface with the nervous system, to communicate with it, to either read out neural signals, electrical potentials, typically it could be chemical, but typically these are electrical signals, or by writing neural signals means writing information into the nervous system. And both of these face a problem of both space and time, delivering spatial patterns and temporal patterns that can mimic the actual nervous system. And then the other big engineering challenge is really the AI challenge of how to emulate neural processes in physical systems. That is, to make a piece of the nervous system in hardware that can compute for example, a sensory signal or a brain circuit signal, transform it into a pattern of activity that can be meaningfully interpreted as either something that's a piece of information coming into the nervous system or a piece of information that's needed to form a command to act. So those are the big challenges. So what I'd like to do, and of course I just want to point out that the nature of neural signals and how to emulate them are intimately tied into each other. The more we know about one, the more we can inform the other. and the, the nature of the tools we have will very much shape the kinds of signals that we can detect, and there are some real challenges there. So what I'd like to do is to give you some very high-level examples. It's really a sampling. It's not a comprehensive review of the current state of technologies that we have, and how and where we are with the neuroscience. That is, what do we know about the neural code? What kind of interfaces do we have, and what can we compute, or how can we emulate those neural functions? So I'll start with paralysis, because this is the area I come from. This is what I've worked on for a number of years. And I'm showing two movies here, one from 2006 and one from 2012 that shows you a 6-year span of activity from our group. And what you see on the left is a young man playing a video game. This is Matt Nagel, and his job is to hit those treasure chests that you can see here and there, and avoid the goblins. And he's not doing such a great job, but he's doing a reasonably good job, because what's surprising about him is that Matt had a spinal cord injury. His brain is completely disconnected from his body due to this spinal cord injury, and he's playing the video game by using his thoughts to think about moving his arm, which he can't move, and then that is being translated into a pattern of activity that the computer thinks is a mouse command, and that mouse command is moving the cursor. So basically what Matt has is he has a tiny chip. You can see down here, it's basically a 10 by 10 microelectrode array. It's implanted into the arm region of his motor cortex. So it's a region that where he generates movement commands. After all these years, it still works, surprisingly, after his injury. It generates a pattern of activity. That is, the area of the cortex generates a pattern of activity. And I've represented that pattern activity by something that I hope is familiar to everybody, a QR code. The idea is that it's a complex pattern that comes out, and you know, if you have your smartphone QR reader, it can interpret what that code is. So not only is that, so each little black and white spot might represent the activity of a neuron at one instant in time, and of course in the real brain that's flickering at every 10 milliseconds or less. So it's a changing dynamic pattern. So when Matt's controlling that cursor, what we're doing is reading out that pattern and interpreting that pattern as a position of the cursor in space. Over the next 6 years, what we did was we said that from that same little patch of cortex, which is 4 by 4 millimeters and about 100 neurons, we can take that activity and we can actually get information about control of the entire arm movement from that small patch. And what you see on the right is Kathy Hutchinson, who had a brainstem stroke that basically disconnected her brain from her body really more than a decade before you see her doing what she's doing in this video. And again, you can see actually she has a plug on her head where the connection is made to the implanted electrode. It's coming out, going through computers, and she's using that signal, again, now not just to control a simple 2D motion of a cursor on a screen, but for the 3D motion to reach out and grasp this container of coffee. So she's feeding herself coffee for the first time in over a decade. Otherwise, what's important is she's completely reliant on other people to even feed or wash or do anything. So the status of this kind of technology is there about, let me just point out one other thing, is if you see this in the setting in where we use this, whoops. Sorry, too many clicks. What I want to point out, and you should pay attention in each of the in each of these examples of neurotechnology, that it's a rather messy scene. As I showed, there's an implanted device in the brain, a plug on the head, wires, and this big cart that's about the size of a small apartment refrigerator contains 4 computers and a signal processor about the size of 2 cigar boxes. And all of that is being used to interpret the brain signals, decode them, and put them onto either a robotic arm or a computer. So as I said, there are about 20 people have been implanted so far with these. There are 6 research labs. 3 of them belong to what's called the BrainGate group, our group, and then there's a number of others that have recently begun to use the same technology to demonstrate that this is really feasible to use. But you can see that the kind of activity you get is not as elegant and smooth and fast as our own arm, but is really quite impressive. Basically, we're using something like 0.005% of the neurons that are in the motor cortex that would ordinarily be engaged in this kind of reach and grasp action. So that's where we are today, and in this case, I'd like to show you a vision of what we'd like to do someday. This is a person who is, imagine a person paralyzed, and we'd like them to reach out and be able to reach out and drink water on their own. And in this case, a system where we would repair this paralysis would consist of the same kind of electrode array implanted in the motor cortex. Now the amplifier system is implanted under the skid. It processes the signals and amplifies them and sends them by radio out to a small pack, which now replaces that sort of apartment-sized refrigerator with a AI-informed kind of processor, and then sends it to another stimulating device that connects to the nerves and would move the arm. Now, the second half of this device actually already exists. There are about 600 people implanted with various simple forms of that kind of what's called a functional electrical stimulation device. So really what doesn't exist is the implanted brain part with the wireless transmission and this sort of belt pack size processor. So this is a vision of where we'd like to go, so that one day a person with paralysis would be unrecognizable from anyone else, and that they would be able to carry out functions, everyday functions, without appearing in any way much different than anyone else. So in terms of sensory loss, here's the current state of restoring hearing with a cochlear implant. So this is a commercial device that's been around for quite a long time now. It was, Graham Clark was one of the pioneers of this, led to, in 1982, developed, I think, which is the basis for today's devices. It became a product in 1984, and there are more than 200,000, probably 250,000 people with these devices. So in these sensory losses, as I mentioned, what generally happens is that the receptor cells degenerate. So in the cochlea, which is the area that transduces the sound signals into neural signals, there are hair cells. The ones that transduce sound, there's about 3,500 of them in each ear. They degenerate, but the nerves stay in place. So the concept is to thread this electrode up through the cochlea, which is sort of a snail shell type arrangement, and place these contacts, these electrical contacts, up close to the nerves, and then by shocking the appropriate electrode at the appropriate time, you can then induce a signal that can be interpreted as sound. So what really happens in this case is that there's an external part. So here's the sound receiver and basically the computational device. It's very simple. All that device does is it takes in the sound. It changes it into a pattern of electrical activity that's delivered to a set of electrodes. Surprisingly, only about 8 of the electrodes or so are used to replace the 3,500 channels that are missing. And that instruction is then sent into the stimulating electrode, and sound is then transduced into this pattern of electrical activity. And I'll play a couple of audios for you to hear. What's interesting about this prosthesis is that it requires learning. That is, when the stimulation is first turned on, the sound of something is reportedly something like this. Not very interpretable, kind of a chirp. But after hearing for a period of time, and this is done frequently in children, but also works in previously hearing adults, the sound is like this.
She's drinking from her own cup.
So that was actually the same sound, but distorted before and now clarified. And reportedly, this is the kind of transformation that's, with experience over months, people acquire the ability to hear. With retinal implants, there's also, these are newer devices, but they're also a device to overcome the loss of vision. Most types of vision loss are due to, again, the receptors degenerate, the light receivers are gone, but the pathways, excuse me, the pathways from the brain back to the, pathways from the eye back to the brain remain. And the concept is to take this wafer electrode, you can see one here that's got contact points that are placed against the retina. They electrically stimulate in patterns, and that pattern of electric stimulation is generated by a camera that's fed to a computer that generates this activation, electrical stimulation, and that gives rise to basically, if you've ever seen what a phosphene is, sometimes if you stand up quickly and you see little flashes of light, these are phosphenes. So the kind of image that people see with the visual, with these kind of visual prostheses look like this, and so even though there's minimal information here, you can recognize that it's a hand. This is clearly not regular vision, but here's a picture of a person that's using this device, and you can see that he's asked to point to the spoon. It takes him a while to scan. He gathers information, and he can point to the spoon. So he can use the information, but it's clearly not everyday vision. This kind of device, the concepts have been around for a long time. Mark Humayun was, again, a pioneer of this in the 1990s. It was FDA approved in the United States in 2013. It is commercially available. I think there are 3 companies producing this. And I'm not exactly sure how many of these are implanted, but there are about 100 or more. And they've recently spread to Europe. There's implants going on in England, if England still counts as Europe, I guess. So, now, another type of neural interface is used, it's called neuromodulation. It's electrical stimulation of brain circuits in order to adjust the circuitry, in order to change the circuitry. And this has a sort of a little bit of an element of voodoo. We shock with these electrodes in the brain circuits, and the circuits change in a way we'd like them to change, but we don't really understand how. So this has been particularly effective in Parkinson's disease. If you don't know, Parkinson's disease is loss of dopamine, which disrupts a very complex basal ganglia circuit. And the result is that people are rigid, they're very slow to move, and they have this shaking palsy. So you can see this lady on the left suffers from pretty severe Parkinson's disease, and she has this kind of shuffling gait with shaking. So she has then had this deep brain stimulating electrode, so it's sort of a spaghetti noodle sized lead placed surgically in her brain. It's placed in this structure called the subthalamic nucleus. It's about the right size in this picture. You can see that the electrode is almost as big in some way, as big as the subthalamic nucleus itself. So these are pretty big electrodes, and there are 4 leads on it. You can see the leads over here in these pictures. To get a sense of the size, these are big. However, and then those sites are stimulated. There's an electrical pulse generator that's put, it's basically placed under the chest skin, above the clavicle, above the collarbone, and the lead is brought up to the head. And when it's connected, this thing is rather dumb. It just stimulates at about 120 times a second through one of the leads. And when that happens, it's rather miraculous. Here it is with the lead on. You can see that she's walking in every way. She looks able-bodied. And I'd say that there's a word of caution here. There's this person looks in every way, completely recovered from the problem, but it doesn't cure the disease. And in fact, there are side effects. People still have issues with their movement. The walking is sometimes not as good as this, and sometimes there are side effects with changes in behavior, because in fact we're stimulating in a way that we don't really understand. And you'll see when I get to the cognitive use of deep brain stimulation that you can see it can have quite profound effects on behavior. Nevertheless, this is an extraordinary device. Benabid developed this in 1984, and it came out in 2013, which I think is a good time mark to see how long it is before the idea was really first presented, and then it became available to people. It takes quite a while, several decades. So it's beyond our 10-year timeline of being able to predict what will happen. It's commercially available by at least 3 companies, and I think I have 100,000 implanted here. I think it's closer to 150 or 200,000, which is often a shock to people to realize that there are hundreds of thousands of people walking around with electrodes in their heads controlled with electrical stimulation, and we don't exactly know what's going on. Some people will maintain they do, but I think this circuit is so complex we don't really understand, but the effect is, as I said, really dramatic. Another application which is brand new, I'd say it's just the early data from a study, human study is coming out, and that is to use the same kind of deep brain stimulating electrode to help slow the cognitive decline of Alzheimer's disease. So this is a study led by Andres Lozano, who's in Toronto, and they have placed these, that was fortuitously discovered in a different context, and I can explain that later if you want. But basically, they implanted these electrodes in a pathway, the fornix, that leads to the hippocampus. We've talked about it a number of times, important for memory formation. And with this electrical stimulation in people who are elderly with Parkinson's disease, the stimulation had an effect. It showed a mild cognitive improvement, and it showed a slower than expected decline in memory, and they and we should be very cautious because the effect is small and the decay of memory in Alzheimer's is so variable that it's very difficult to be certain that this is having a profound effect. It's a very early investigational study, but it's quite promising that electrical stimulation can seem to have some effect on changes in memory. And as they put down, they were, as I like how cautious they were, people older than 65 may have derived benefit. And which was an interesting and unexpected control is that people who were below 65 seem to get worse with stimulation. But this, again, this is something promising, changing a cognitive function with brain stimulation, again, open to more study. Another really spectacular use of deep brain stimulation is to treat affective disorders. Here, Helen Mayberg has been working on emotion circuits, specifically trying to treat depression. And they've, again, I don't know the total number of people treated, but it's somewhere approaching 100. And the idea is to treat people who are medically refractory to treatment. These are people with very severe depression. And I'll play a video from a CNN TV show that shows a woman who has severe depression, and she's in the operating room, and they turn on the different leads. And I think the lesson here to pay attention to is that this person's affect, their emotional state, is being altered by stimulating different electrodes in their brain and influencing these circuits, again, in ways that I would say we don't truly understand.
They asked Edie to rate her feelings on a scale of 1 to 10, starting with dread.
My sense of dread is getting worse.
Your sense of dread is getting worse. Rate it.
Okay.
2 minutes later, they turned on one of the 4 contacts.
How does it feel right now? Is it still high?
No, it's much less.
What's the dread right now?
3.
A drop from 8 to 3, but doctors would soon get an even better result.
I feel like they're going to make some changes.
Remember, before the surgery, Edie could not connect emotionally with her grandniece, Susan. Then,
Stream on.
they turned on contact number 2.
Just let me know if anything changes. Just give a shout.
Okay. I just almost smiled.
You just almost smiled?
Yeah,
Describe that for us, would you please?
I didn't smile. I haven't smiled for like a long time. Or laughed.
It brings tears to your eyes to see somebody that is in such pain, and then that goes away.
When you say you almost smiled, did something strike you as funny, or is it just sort of spontaneous?
It was, well, I was thinking of playing with Susan.
I started thinking about Susan, little Susan. And I thought I was I was holding her with her face to me.
So that's really profound in that her emotional state was changed by even which electrode was put on. So in summary, we have the beginnings of tools that can give us sensory replacement, motor output replacement, and modulating circuits. But I would say with the sensory system, we have some useful hearing, but this is not perfect. Language understanding, listening in crowds is not that good. Listening to music is not that good. With vision, you could see that the visual recovery is certainly not normal vision. With movement, we have an ambition to restore, natural kinds of movement, but we're far from that. It's slower and less accurate and less dexterous than what people would want to have. and certainly not of their own body. For Parkinson's disease, we have a commercially effective product, and we can see, I'd say we're uncertain that we can affect both memory and mood, but there's certainly active research programs going on. And I didn't mention epilepsy because I didn't have time, but there's also the same kinds of devices are being applied to treat epilepsy. So I just wanted, so as far as the potential and problems, I think the neural code is a big problem. In order to make these devices work properly, we have to understand the multi-scale level of activity, the dynamics, the plasticity, and what I call the network of networks, and I'll just do this quickly because I'm running out of time. So if we go from neurons to networks of neurons to large-scale networks of networks, we really have a multi-scale problem. I'd say we know a lot about individual neurons, and I think this sort of middle-scale understanding of the dynamics of networks and networks of networks is still rather primitive, but will be essential to advancing these devices. And then in the engineering domain, we need to make better interfaces, and I can talk about longevity if people are interested in, and exactly where and how in these areas of the brain or in the nervous, other parts of the nervous system, we want to stimulate, and then to be able to implant them so that they can be small inside the body or just easily wearable. They can be fast, they can have low power, and they have to have very high processing speed. And finally, we need to be able to process these algorithms so that we can take the spatial temporal patterns that come out of the nervous system and turn them into something that's a meaningful command to either input structures or output structures or neural circuits. And we need to come up with devices that people will accept. The cochlear implant still has a lot of outside hardware. We still have rather dumb stimulators that are implanted. So I won't go through all this because we're running out of time. I can just quickly summarize it by saying that the neurotechnology is rapidly advancing, but we still have problems that I just mentioned. And I think we still have potential for disruptive changes. I do want to point out this is the evolution of cell phones, and I think in 1973, even when you had this large, bulky cell phone that you knew you would, I think people didn't know what a smartphone would look like even over the 44 years of evolution of smartphones. So I think we're going to see this incremental change in neurotechnologies that will happen over the next decades, and it's hard to predict how long that will take. It has great potential to restore. I think that the thing that I really hope to see is enabling full human potential, being able to overcome whatever the disorder, allow people to realize whatever they want, and so that they look like this lady you saw in the video where you don't see any hardware, you don't see any apparatus, they're just back to living their normal life. I think we can bring up this issue for discussion later. I think as we go forward, there will be a potential to augment human function. That could be good or might not be. And we can have things like enhanced sensation or better movement abilities or better brain circuits, that is better memory. So I think as I close, just to say that now is a time to deal with ethics, and also there's a lot of false claims of efficacy that we should also be monitoring and make sure that there's rigorous evidence of the benefit of these devices. Thanks.